Before we begin this journey, please subscribe and like so more people find hopeful, values-driven stories. Thank you for being here. The wind cut across the high plains like a saw through bone-dry timber. Dust rattled against the station windows and stung exposed skin. A late afternoon sun burned low, throwing long rails of shadow across the wooden platform. A young woman in a travel-worn dress sat alone with a letter that had ended everything she believed about herself. She had crossed desert reaches and mountain passes because a notice promised a steady home. She had traded keepsakes for tickets and pride for hope. The letter in her hands said she was not the sort of woman a good household needed. It said her heritage did not match expectations. It said a return ticket waited for morning. Her name was Elena Rivera. She was 24, stubborn, careful, and too polite to cry where strangers could see. She pressed the torn envelope flat against her knee and tried to steady her breath. Freight wagons clattered, mules brayed, and a telegraph clicked like an impatient clock. The wooden bench creaked when she shifted her weight. A small presence paused beside the bench with the soft gravity of a child who sensed sorrow. The child's dress carried careful stitches and prairie dust. A stuffed hare with rubbed ears rested in her elbow. The girl studied Elena with frank curiosity, like someone listening for thunder no one else heard. Elena managed a steady posture and a thin smile. She believed in quiet endurance. She believed in tidy ledgers, careful savings, and the strength to rise early. She felt the child's gaze and wondered what kindness still lived in a world that measured worth by last names and skin. Evening stretched itself across the tracks. A tall rider crossed the yard with a deliberate stride learned from long seasons of responsibility. He carried the patient fatigue of a man who ran toward problems before they grew fangs. The child turned her face toward him with practiced relief. The rider's hat brim cut a clean edge through the light. A station hand called his name in passing. Folks here called him Thomas Harper. He answered with a nod and the quiet assurance of a man who preferred work over speech. He saw the child near the bench and adjusted course. The audience likely wondered whether chance meetings ever mended cracked futures. The audience likely weighed whether a heart dismissed on paper could still be chosen in practice. Elena's stomach tightened as the rider neared. She slipped the letter into her satchel as if hiding an open wound. She did not know this town. She knew only that tomorrow's train promised a humiliating return to the same small room she had left. The child stood with ceremony and lifted the stuffed hare as if presenting credentials. The rider glanced from the child to Elena and took in the travel-worn satchel, the tired shoes, and the dignity held like a candle cupped against wind. Something in his face softened, then steadied. Elena's mind drifted toward survival arithmetic. She calculated miles home and pennies needed for food. She counted possibilities like a schoolteacher counting slates. Pride measured against hunger. Safety measured against shame. Sleep measured against a cold platform under a colder sky. A lean bay horse stamped near the hitching rail. Harness leather creaked in the cooling air. Someone laughed inside the depot and then stopped, as if laughter dared too much in a place like this. A train whistle moaned somewhere beyond the bend. The sound reached Elena like a summons to surrender. She stood to leave the platform and find a corner for the night. The child watched with grave attention learned from early loss. The rider let the silence settle, then made a simple gesture toward the depot door. He carried the look of a man who believed neighbors should not go hungry. Elena hesitated, then followed. Inside, the air smelled of varnish, paper, and old coal smoke. A pot of coffee steamed near a ledger dusted with cinders. A clock read 5:42 p.m. Time felt like a stern supervisor. Elena accepted a tin cup with both hands. warmth moved from palms to chest, like courage in slow ascent. The child sat on a bench and organized the stuffed hare with field marshal precision. The rider set 2 coins on the counter and waited while the station agent counted change. Elena sipped carefully and considered trust in small, manageable portions. She had learned that gratitude could sit beside caution without argument. The audience likely felt the edge of a turning point. The audience likely weighed whether compassion could carry weight without collapsing under gossip. A few hours later, lights flickered across the yard as lanterns took their posts. The rider offered a practical arrangement in the language of chores and fair pay. Elena's back straightened at the word work. She knew how to scrub, mend, tally, and keep a kitchen trim. She also knew numbers better than most traveling men, which sometimes surprised them. They left the station in a wagon that had seen hard winters. A crescent moon cut a thin smile over the ridge. The road formed 2 pale ruts leading through sage and scrub. Coyotes threaded their music along a dry creek bed. The child fought sleep with brave blinks, then lost the battle against the night. The ranch waited in a shallow basin ringed by cottonwoods. A windmill turned with tired purpose over a dark well mouth. The main house held the bones of care and the dust of recent neglect. Elena saw a front porch that could be swept into welcome. She saw a kitchen that could learn warmth again. She felt the old ache of belonging stir like coals under ash. Morning arrived at 6:11 a.m., with rooster bravado and pale fire at the east horizon. Elena tied her hair, rolled her sleeves, and approached the kitchen like a command post. Flour bloomed, yeast awoke, and coffee spoke in friendly drips. The child appeared with bed-tousled hair and solemn eyes that brightened at the first smell of bread. Days formed an honest rhythm. Elena stitched buttons, calmed storms in a small heart, and tuned the house to steady notes. She discovered ledgers burdened by late notices and careless arithmetic. She found invoices that wandered, like cabs through broken fence lines. Thomas watched her total columns, and some hard knot between his eyes loosened. The child loved the new songs at dusk. Elena did not own many songs, but she carried a few faithful ones with strong spines. The child fell asleep to those slow rivers, face turned toward tomorrow with new courage. Thomas usually stood in the doorway and listened with his hat in his hands. The audience likely wondered how quickly gratitude becomes attachment. The audience likely measured the line between provisional help and chosen family. One afternoon, a stranger rode in with a smile that never touched his eyes. He carried the loose confidence of a man who knew hidden ledgers. He called himself Cole Danner. He wore the ranch foreman's swagger without the ranch foreman's care. Elena saw how the horses tightened under his hand, and the child stepped closer to her skirt. Danner assured Thomas that repairs ran late and shipments ran early. He spoke in vague promises and quick nods. Elena watched his words like a banker studies numbers. She found odd gaps and missing pieces. She said nothing. She stacked facts like kindling. At 4:03 p.m. that same day, a letter arrived with a pressed seal. The envelope bore the same hand that had cut Elena's future in two. She took it outside and read by the corral rail. The words condemned her again with quiet cruelty. The message claimed to protect respectable households. It urged decent men to avoid trouble. Elena felt heat rise and then cool into iron. She held the new letter against the old one and measured the flourishes. The hands matched, but the ink felt meaner and the grammar stumbled. She had copied accounts for years and recognized patterns like fingerprints. A suspicion formed with sharp teeth. The audience likely leaned forward. The audience likely sensed a concealed hand meddling with other people's futures. Over the next week, Elena watched the ranch books with a hawk's patience. Cattle counts slipped like wet stones. Salt and seed orders doubled without reason. A delivery receipt bore the same odd loop her rejection letter carried. She traced the loop with a fingernail and knew the truth. Cole Danner had forged the letter that sent her away before she even arrived. He had salted the ranch books to keep Thomas distracted. He had a reason to isolate a widower and his daughter. A lonely house protected schemes as well as any lock. Alina took a breath that felt like drawing a line in the prairie dust. She gathered the child's chalk and marked the kitchen slate with bundled numbers. She mapped dates, head counts, and freight notes. Patterns stepped out of hiding and saluted. She waited until the right evening to reveal the slate. Thomas studied the chalked proof with a stillness learned from cattle drives and graveside promises. Fury moved under that stillness like a river under ice. He asked careful questions and accepted precise answers. He did not raise his voice. He set his hat on the table and considered the work ahead. They agreed on a plan built from daylight and witnesses. Elena's part included telegram copies and neighboring brands. Thomas's part included men he trusted and a calm voice at the bank. The child's part included staying close and listening for mother songs at dusk. She accepted the assignment with solemn pride. The audience likely recognized how small households fight large wrongs. The audience likely remembered that careful women often save more than kitchens. When the trap finally closed, it snapped like a frost-cracked branch. Thomas met Danner the north pasture during a scheduled head count. 2 neighbors arrived on time with clean notebooks. Elena walked the line with a tally stick and a schoolmarm's glare. The numbers refused to be bullied. Danner's smile thinned. His hands stayed too near his belt. By 2:28 p.m., a deputy from the nearest town rode in under an open sky. He carried warrants written by a county clerk who liked precise ink. The deputy spoke little and listened much. He read the ledger pages Elena offered and nodded once. He asked Danner about duplicate salt orders. Danner's answers arrived late and limp. Dark clouds pulled over the ridge like a stage curtain. Wind rattled the pens and shivered the cottonwoods. Danner saw the net and reached for escape. The child watched from the porch and squeezed her stuffed hair so hard its stitched eye strained. Elena moved between the porch and the pens with guardian ease. Danner bolted for his horse and found nothing where a saddle should be. Thomas had moved the tack earlier under a routine excuse. The deputy stepped close with quiet authority. Danner spat a curse and swung instead for the child like a cornered coyote lunging toward easy pain. He aimed to damage what he could not keep. Elena moved ground with the speed of a sprinter and the focus of a surgeon. She reached the porch first and lifted the child behind her. Thomas crossed the yard with ranch boss speed and outstretched arms. The deputy's hand stayed steady. Danner saw 3 lines of defense and chose the fence line. Rain began in fat, decisive drops. Danner scrambled through barbed wire and tore his sleeve. He vanished into sage dotted with late summer blooms. Hoofbeats thundered as neighbors gave chase at a safe distance. The child trembled and then steadied against Elena's shoulder. Elena smoothed the girl's hair and whispered mother-brave words without sound. The deputy returned at 5:07 p.m. with mud on his boots and a succinct report. Danner had been arrested near a dry arroyo where stolen cattle once turned. He would answer to charges written in firm hands. The deputy apologized for the delay between suspicion and action. He tipped his hat to the household bookkeeper who had drawn a map through fog. Evening settled with a gentler wind. Thomas stood on the porch and looked at the 2 people who had turned his silent house into a living place. He understood in that quiet that provision meant more than feed and fence posts. It meant safety enough for singing and structure enough for growth. The audience likely felt the lift of earned relief. The audience likely knew this was not the end of the story, only the end of a chapter. Weeks shaped themselves around small routines that mattered. Elena taught the child to braid hair with patient hands. She taught Stu to gather flavor from bones in time. She taught the ledgers a firm spine and the pantry a winter plan. The house learned to breathe again. Thomas learned to ask for help before the roof leaked. He learned that grief could share a room with hope and not drive it out. He learned to trust a woman who trusted numbers and people in equal measure. He caught himself watching the doorway at day's end, not for trouble, but for return. Autumn ripened. The cottonwoods turned gold like held fire. The windmills sang a steadier note. Neighbors began to visit as if the ranch had stepped back onto the shared map. A Sunday sawdust smell rose from the clean porch. Elena set a loaf to cool and considered a future built from work and choice, not scarcity and fear. The child, whose name was June, grew braver by inches. She asked small questions and believed patient answers. She slept without checking the door twice. She carried the stuffed hare less as a shield and more as a friend. She began to hum the dusk songs herself. The first snow arrived at 7:19 a.m. with shy flakes learning their shapes. Elena stood at the window and thought about vows. She did not believe in fairy luck. She believed in deliberate promises made when storms tested fences. She believed in families that formed on purpose, not by accident. Thomas walked in with cheeks stung pink by the cold. He placed a small tin on the table with the formality of a man laying down a burden. Inside lay a simple brooch his late wife had favored. He had carried it like a knot of grief and duty. He told a plain story in a few careful sentences and asked a question that did not need grand words. Elena felt the ground steady under her feet. She understood that saying yes meant choosing a life with winter chores, summer dust, and honest neighbors. It meant accepting a history that included loss and the work of tending what remained. It meant motherhood offered not by birth, but by daily courage. The audience likely smiled at the quiet clarity of chosen family. The audience likely recognized how love often looks like bread, ledgers, and warm lamplight. They planned a small ceremony that respected both memory and tomorrow. June practiced carrying a ribbon with parade seriousness. Elena mended a dress with careful seams. Thomas sanded a splintered porch rail until it felt like mercy under the hand. The neighbors baked things that demanded sugar and community. The twist arrived with a courier's urgency and a winter sun glancing off ice. A rider brought a telegram addressed to the county office. The deputy passed it along with eyes that already apologized. Elena took the folded slip and braced herself for another old cruelty resurrected. She read slowly and felt the ground shift under the kitchen floorboards. The telegram said a woman named Margaret Hale had survived a river accident 3 years prior. She had been carried downstream and rescued by a remote homestead. Illness stole her memory and years, then returned them piece by piece. She now remembered a husband named Thomas and a daughter with summer blue eyes. The room narrowed to a single sound, the clock at 10:16 a.m. Elena steadied her hands on the table and waited for her heart to choose between duty and desire. Thomas read the message and did not move for a long breath. June traced the carved table edge as if it held a map to safety. The audience likely felt the world tilt. The audience likely measured the distance between what is right and what is bearable. Another letter followed 2 days later, written in a hand that knew this house. It spoke of survival on a cold river and a long climb back to memory. It spoke of a promise made at an altar years before. It asked for a meeting at the church under the cottonwoods on Sunday at 3 p.m. Snow lifted in fine veils that afternoon. Elena wrapped June in a winter shawl and planned careful words that honored everyone. Thomas saddled the bay with steady hands. None of them pretended this choice would be simple. Each carried a different weight toward the same door. They reached the church as sunlight thinned. The cottonwoods held their gold like a hush. A figure waited near the steps with a posture Elena recognized from an old photograph on a shelf. The woman's face carried both distance and return. Her eyes turned toward June and filled with something deeper than weather. Elena stepped aside and felt her heart dig for courage. Thomas stood between past and future like a man on a split bridge. June looked from face to face and held the stuffed hair like a compass. The audience likely held its breath. The woman took a step forward, then stopped, as if listening to a quiet order. Footsteps sounded behind the group. The deputy approached with an envelope sealed by the county. His expression carried the gravity of law and the softness of friendship. He held papers that could change names and lives. He said the county had found records that did not match known dates. He said a marriage certificate had been filed twice under different names during the missing years. He said someone had profited by a widow's grief and a town's assumptions. He lifted the envelope and waited for consent to open it. Elena met Thomas's eyes. June gripped her hand with fierce trust. The snow fell as if the sky exhaled slow forgiveness. Somewhere in the windmill, a gear clicked into place. The deputy broke the seal. The page inside would name who had been married to whom and when. It would establish the bone-deep truth beneath rumor and fear. It would decide where vows still held and where new vows could begin. Elena planted her feet on the cold church steps and steadied her breath. She silently promised the child a steady hand no matter the verdict. She braced for mercy or undoing with the same open spine. The envelope's contents slid free, and the deputy began to read in a voice that carried across the yard like a bell. The story paused there, with wind in the cottonwoods and three futures bent toward a single sentence, waiting to be spoken.